I also would like to welcome you, although I'm also kind of a guest in Kuala Lumpur, but as a board member of Istanbul Network for Liberty, it's really a pleasure to have all these participants in this conference. Indeed, when we when we had all the submissions of paper proposals, when we announced this program, I was really astonished and very much pleased to see and read all the paper proposals. And I said it's very important to continue this initiative, Istanbul Network for Liberty, which has a unique historic mission and goal. And it was really very motivative to read all papers. So I think these 2 days are quite challenging and inspiring for us to hear different experiences from all around the Muslim countries. All around. As it is expressed in the very beginning, the mission of Istanbul Network for Liberty is to explore the ideas of a free society in the Muslim world. So we hear the experiences of different countries which have had in the past roots of ideas of free society within their historical and philosophical experiences. And we have now some problems, contemporary problems within our cultures, within our political systems. So it is very crucial to come together and both to reveal our historical and philosophical commonalities and also discuss our problems within our own experience and also try to find a common framework for our debates. So this session, named Narrative on Islam and Democracy, is going to start with the presentation of Professor Ahmet Kemal Bayram, who is teaching at Marmara University, who is teaching political philosophy at Marmara University. He is going to discuss a hermeneutic approach on our debates about the discussion about the relation between Islam and democracy. So you have 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Ozlem. It's a big, really a big experience, and it's a very exciting experience for me to address such a distinguished persons, of course. Okay, ladies, gentlemen, and all distinguished guests, I have big salams from Turkey again. And my full name, Ahmet Kemal, therefore in the somewhere it is just Kemal Bayram. I'm a bit sensitive, I do not know, but I am a bit sensitive in this way. Okay, in my presentation, of course, the paper is already there with you. In my presentation, I am going to just pick up some outstanding remarks. And I also add, in my revision, I add a subtitle to my title, A Quest for Method, actually. And I know this is not a very easy job, but it is very clear that we must face the problem, because this is, of course, my personal view in this way. Method in our scientific enterprise in these days, especially following the scientific revolutions of 19th centuries, basically the chemical revolution, method itself, it became the main central point of all scientific enterprise. And even we clearly see that, for example, Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, he calls that the triumph of scientism in the 19th century. It is not the triumph of science, but it is the triumph of scientific method. Scientific method is, of course, it is full of many problems. There are many debates around it with basically philosophical content. And in my presentation, I'm not going to, if you ask something, of course, I will try to answer your questions. but I am not too much, let's say, involved in philosophical analysis. And the central question, actually, in my presentation is that why is there a need? Why do we require the rereading of the relation between Islam and democracy? I think there is a need, and why do we need so? In social sciences, there are two traditions of method for the, of course, better explanation or for better understanding of social and political life. On one hand, they are usually in extreme points. On one extreme point, there is a positivist political science, and on the other one, as an hermeneutical approach, let's say, as an alternative to positivism for all social sciences. We clearly know that positivist political science or positivist method, it is inspired by the success of the methodological monism that is at the service of natural sciences. We clearly know this, and this is an aim. The basic aim of positivism is to explain something, not to understand or not to interpret, but explain something. Because as a result, or let's say at the final point of your explanation, through positivism, forecasting related to future, foreseeing something related to future is possible. Therefore, we clearly know that it is always much more functional for political purposes, not scientific ones, I think, but political purposes. This kind of approach is always very functional. On the other point, when we talk about hermeneutics or interpretive theory, we clearly see that it is an alternative to the philosophies of positivism. But the hermeneutical approach is not too much interested in, let's say, explaining something, but it aims at understanding the intersubjective meanings. This is very important. It should be underlined, I think, intersubjective meanings where in multi-layered and interconnected, I mean the complex nature of social life. It is to say that the social life is definitely, or let's say categorically, much different from the natural environment, because we all clearly know that, because we are as human beings as a part of the social life too. And putting these, let's say, these opening remarks, this is some of ideas or some of, let's say, assumptions I put, of course. In the previous sessions, some of my colleagues tackled them too. But everybody refers to Huntington's the famous formulation, the let's say the clash of civilization, and he adds actually a subtitle: Remaking New World Order. And therefore, we clearly see that the famous question related to the compatibility of Islam with democracy stem from their, let's say, their studies. The relation between Islam and especially compatibility of Islam with democracy, we can count them, has brought about a boom of studies. There are many studies with these contents. But we clearly see that these studies are mainly carried out in a positivistic way with implicit or explicit political purposes. We can never be sure whether the political purposes are implicitly there or explicitly take place. And these studies, because of the methodological problems intrinsic into positivism, these studies usually suffer from overgeneralizations first, and we clearly see some stereotypes, ethnocentric stereotypes, and it is usually all these findings as a result of these positivist methods, they are usually at the service of, the data usually at the service of the dominant discursive let's say, discursive apparatus. And as a result, all the knowledge are produced in the form of power. Knowledge and power is definitely, as a result, they are identified, they become the same thing. And I'm going to, in my presentation, I'm going to give some examples of these overgeneralizations. And these overgeneralizations are mainly, let's say, caused by ethnocentrism and, as I put, methodological shortcomings, of course. And when we think of the relations between Islam and democracy and all the studies dedicated to this problem, firstly, at the beginning, initially, they missed a very, very important point, I think, because in any field studies, we clearly tell our students that first, determine your sample clearly, for example. Or if it is a field study, you must firstly determine your scope very well. A very well scope is needed. A clearly defined scope is needed. And we clearly see that Islamic State, Islamic world, or Muslim societies, actually, they are all labels. I know these are let's say, my statements may be a bit, let's say, provocative, but we can talk about this. These are all labels, actually nothing else, and maybe I run the risk of self-contradiction. We had better use, let's say, Muslim majority countries, maybe, but this is a label itself too. Of course, all these societies are not singular abstracts. They are not abstractions. They are not, let's say, abstract forms. They are, in reality, it is to say that they are plural and concrete entities, always in flux, in changing. Therefore, these kind of labelings are a problem themselves, and in these, let's say, plural concrete entities, we clearly know that they have their own, they have their unique and their particular cultures, and whatever the society is, this is not, I think, just related to the Muslim majority ones. A society's culture is not just confined to the just religion or just mere religion. It is to say that there are many factors that, let's say, that become very influential on cultural characteristics of society. Religion is only one of them, of course. Yeah, like all the other cultures, these kind of cultures have their own historical, let's say, experiences, their own historical uniqueness. Therefore, even these labels, Muslim world, Islamic, these kind of labels, they do not correspond to a clear fact. For example, we are in Malaysia. I think when you talk about Malaysia society, how can you use that? This is a Muslim country. What are your criteria to put such an, let's say, such a labeling? It is to say that as a result, I can put that Islam or democracy, even the same, they are not fixed categories. They are not fixed categories. They are not. They are always in changing. They have different forms, and their forms are always in flux. In this way, if we, for example, empirically, in this way, we are going to be very, let's say, strictly empirical. And if we let's suppose that. If we empirically prove that, I mean, our empirical evidences are going to prove us that Islam is not compatible with democracy, what will happen then? There are two ways, I think, only two ways. Then someone will democratize Islam or Islamize democracy. There is no any other way. Then what will happen? You are going to give up, forget Islam. You are going to say, forget Islam, for example, if it is so. And therefore, we clear, or again, I put it right down, think the statement in a reverse form. Okay, is Islam compatible with democracy, or what about is democracy compatible with Islam? These are, they sound very nice, very well, but there are too many logical gaps in these ways, I think. And putting such relations between Islam and democracy mainly, I think, is a result of political purposes in a bit larger scale, or this may be like not an Islamist activist, or this may be non-Muslim scholars may have this one. This is really very interesting that Muslim scholars or Islamist activities also find themselves in the same way. In a romantic or apologetic presentations of Islam, actually they contribute the same understanding. And of course, both this attitude of both Muslim and non-Muslims, they bring about Islam as they contribute the otherness of Islam. It is the other of the, let's say, ideological rival to the mainstream, let's say, mainstream understanding of all these things. And therefore, Islam in this way is expected to play its role, and politically definitely it's a very, very fruitful instrument, very, very good, let's say, opportunity. Of course, despite all this, there is a fact that there is in Muslim majority countries, there is a fact of Islamism, let's say. And we clearly see that Islamism is sometimes put in a fundamentalist version of a religion, but this is a much more, I think, it's a much more socio-political fact. It's a socio-political result it came to picture. Because Islamism, we experience Islamism in many countries, even in my country, in Turkey, for example, the ruling party is labeled, oh, this is Islamist, they are Islamists. But, for example, in Turkey, think of legislation, for example. I never see any, although the ruling party has the majority of chairs in assembly, there is no any legislation stemmed from Sharia laws, let's say, or stemmed from Quran. I never met this one, for example. And why is it so? Because I think this is not a matter of religion. This is not something mainly related to religion, but this is a social, let's say, a social and political result. We see that there are fundamentalist versions of all religions in the world, not only Islam. You know this one, and some theologians, for example, my colleague Hassan, I am sure he's good at doing this. But Islamism is not a war between, let's say, Muslims and Christians. Islam was considered by Islamism as a solution. As a solution to what? For example, to eradicate poverty, for example, or let's say for all injustice or immorality or corruption. And it is clear that in many Muslim majority countries, the political life is characterized by, for example, autocratic monarchies, military republicanism, state socialism, Baas nationalism, and you see all these are with anti-democratic character. And another interesting question, we must answer the question. I put some characteristics, let's say, characteristics of their political system. Which of the characteristics is directly tied to Islam, or how can you put a connection between, for example, between military, how can you put a connection between military republican understanding and Islam? Okay, then for all these reasons, I think there's a problem, but this problem is not about Islam, I think, but the problem is about Muslims. It is not about the Quran, or it is not about the tradition of Islam, but it is about the understanding, the interpretation of all these. And therefore, my final remarks, I'm going to put my final, okay, I know I exceed my time. Because of all the aforementioned problems, when we think of the questions, when we think of the critical subjects like the relation, the nature of the relation between Islam and democracy, the constructive hermeneutical method, because it cares about all the multi-layered, let's say, the complex structure of any society. It will enable us to have a better understanding of what is going on. But I think embracing of the method will not be enough itself, because we must keep a permanent caution in problematization, because problematization is a problem itself. I must speak very fast. Then if you ask anything, okay. And unfortunately, whatever your method is, I put a list of some challenging questions. How can we answer the questions? I do not know. For example, I deliberately put has there been, not is there, but has there been any political system implemented Sharia laws, for example? Or even today, you think, is there any country, is there any political system in the world implemented Islamic Sharia laws? You know, for example, it was very popular in these days, last week or 10 days ago, in Saudi Arabia, the women, they were allowed to have driving lessons. What happened? Something changed in Sharia? Some Sharia laws changed? Or these are a bit provoking questions, of course. And or does Islamic State mean the same thing all Muslims? If yes, the Islamic State means all the same thing. What are the distinguishing characteristics of such state organization? What makes it Islamic? What makes a state Islamic but not the other ones? Or is it possible to distinguish the world as non-Muslims and Muslims? Or Christians or non-Christians? How is it possible? Or are all Arabs Muslims, or are all Muslims, or are all Turks Muslims, or something like that? I finished with these provoking questions. Thank you.
Well, liberals are after rules, actually, not toleration at every place. So there is also another misconception about liberals. Liberals defend a rule-based system. So thank you so much. Your final questions had been not provoking, not only provoking, actually the discussions on their answers actually define our approaches. So you very well proposed the importance of the complex nature of our societies. So to understanding this complex nature is perhaps more moral and more legitimate than trying to explain. First of all, more superior, not we can say moral, but more superior. We need a method to understand the complex nature of the society instead of just defining, and instead of creating an otherness or two sides between Islam and democracy, we better need to promote a methodological pluralism to understand the solutions of our problems. So before moving to the next speaker, as you would notice, there was another speaker in our session, Mrs. Dina Abdelkader. She was coming from US. Unfortunately, she missed her flight and she missed this session, but we will be hopefully able to hear her tomorrow. We will continue with our next speaker, Dr. Seyed Emamian. He's coming from Tehran. He's leading a think tank working on public policy. We are going to hear his comments, analysis on the rise and fall of the Iranian Reformists. So, Dr. Emamian, the floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me here, and thanks for all the organizers. Such a great event. Actually, I would like to first of all recognize and acknowledge the contribution of two of my colleagues in the paper, Dr. Nariman and Dr. Akbari. My paper is more an empirical study of what is happening, what has happened in last few years in Iranian politics, rather than a kind of the theoretical and conceptual debate that has been dominating since the beginning of this event. My focus is between 1997 and 2005, the reformist government, so-called reformist government in Iranian politics, and the reason of their rise and fall. But I can't ignore the kind of the historical background, and I need to contextualize what has happened in that period. The history goes back to almost 200 years ago, and since then we have always witnessed a kind of the contradiction and challenge between two different interpretations of Islam. Islamic, more traditional interpretation against the kind of the modernized, westernized interpretation of Islam that has framed almost all political debates and political game in Iran. Albeit there are a lot of a wide range of the different aspects, different mix of these two extreme versions of the interpretation of Islam. On the one hand, someone says that we need to be committed fully to the Islamic Iranian tradition with no Western elements inside it. And on the other hand, there are kind of the pure secular westernized solutions that has been always several different mix of this kind of the two extreme versions. And as I said, I could say that all political debate has been framed based on such a dichotomy and polarization. To be honest, a starting point goes back to the Russian-Iran war in almost 200 years ago. After the defeat, heavy defeat, that Iranian defeat there, it was a kind of the question rose that why Iran always lagging behind the developed countries, and what is the role of the Islam, and what is the solution for our society. But the conflict, such a conflict was manifested in constitutional movement. Once it was a kind of the huge challenge between two camps, both with a huge support of the religious leaders. The one camp, constitutional movement camp, was supported by Akhund Khorasani and some other religious thinkers from Najaf, pure, fully in support of the democratization of the society, having council and some other aspects. Another camp was a traditional camp led by Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri. But it was a dramatic end of this challenge by the heavy defeat of the traditional camp. It was the execution of, public execution of the Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, that it was a still controversial and very important period of the Iranian political history. With the emergence of Pahlavi era, it was the end of both ideal camps, democratic camps and Islamic camps. Why? Because whilst Pahlavi established to some extent the first modern state in Iran by centralizing the power, having a powerful army, establishing a bureaucratic system, but they were publicly anti-religious, and they were totalitarian, both Pahlavis, totalitarian regimes, and with no democratic elements in them. It was the reason of the Islamic Revolution in 1970s that it was a kind of the political consensus between two camps against the Pahlavi, because Islamic movements and also democratic movements both were against the Pahlavi eras. And in the beginning years, in early years of the Islamic Revolution, it was a kind of the political consensus between two camps. But then, since then, all the political movements have clear mix of both elements, democratic and Islamic elements. No one in Iran says we don't need any kind of Islamic elements. No one says public that we don't need any kind of the democratic elements. But in early years, because of some contextual events, like particularly Iran-Iraq war, a kind of a securitization happened in Iranian politics. And because of the need for social stability and such kind of the pretext, it was a kind of relative gain of traditional camps against the modern pro-Western camps, particularly because of the war context, the context of war. There are some other reasons also for the dominance of the traditional camps in the early years of the post-Islamic revolution. One of them was the way and the mode of the charismatic leadership of Khomeini as the founder of the Islamic revolution, as a traditional personality, as a traditional religious leader. And also, what was very important at the time was the collapse and administrative weakness of two first short temporary governments that both were pro-Western at the time and pro-democracy, something like that, Bazargan and Benisad. Both were administratively weak, and particularly in the early years of the war, they had no victory in the war. And it was a kind of, they lost their popularity then. And because of the war situation, it was the gain of the traditional camp. Particularly propaganda machine of the traditional camp with a religious kind of the discourse was able to have a kind of the public support for the war. And they gained several victories in the war, and it was legitimized them. They legitimized the traditional camp as a solution for a national problem, national crisis like the war. But just in the post-war context, Hashemi's administration started and rooted some elements of modernization of Iranian politics. While Hashemi himself belonged to the traditional camp, and he, to some extent naively, was thinking about a distinction between economic liberalization and political liberalization. But which kind of the technocratic administration, Hashemi rooted some elements of the modernization of the government by huge privatization and internationalization of the Iranian economy, liberalization of Iranian economy, and some clear elements of the capitalism that came into Iranian politics after several years of the dominance of the social economic solutions. And expansion and the rise of the middle class in Iranian society, with some kind of the free spaces that Hashemi provided for reformists in Iran. Several think tanks and journals and intellectual circles started to promote, to influence politics at the time. One of the most important was Center for Strategic Studies then in presidential office, that Hashemi was thinking that Hashemi gifted that center to a reformist to keep them silent. But it was a very important platform for them, with no administrative border, with a very good access to the data, to draft a first political liberalization plan for Iran. With the victory of the Khatami in 1997, it was an official manifestation of the reformist, Western-oriented reformist government at the Iran, with the clear liberty and democracy in their discourse. But the beginning of the official victory was the beginning of the political decline for them, because of the no hegemonous nature of this movement. I'm thinking reformist movement, not political party. And with a very heterogeneous mix of the supporters. And also, to be honest, governing the society is not an easy task, and it was the beginning of the decline of their discourse. I would like to highlight some points why the reformist discourse started to decline at the time that they had official power in the country. One of them was the nature of the movement itself, with no well-established political party behind it. A kind of the social movement, very heterogeneous social movement. And what was very important was the dominance of radical frictions within that movement, with a kind of the pragmatic naivety inside them. They started to use a kind of the war terminology at the time, very aggressive, that polarized society and made a kind of the political consensus within the establishment that we are in the risk. The country is in the risk. And it led gradually to a kind of the political consensus within other political rivals. Yeah. That these kind of the movements would be too risky for the national security. And also the elite-based movement, they had no popularity, particularly in lay people and poor people. And also they're easily framed as anti-national movement because of their clear pro-Western discourse and some other symbolic elements that happened at the time. And they were unlucky, to be honest. At the time, there was a time that Bush came to power, and it was a very radical anti-Iran and anti-Islam rhetoric at the time. And it was a collapse of the Khatamist discourse that was a civilization dialogue at the time. And some very technical mistake that they made by the 1999 riots, attacking security and intelligence services in Iran, and some specific symbolic elements. Just I would like to highlight some of them. It's very empirically important. There was a cartoon published in one journal in Tehran, the Reformist journal, against Mesbah Yazdi, one of the clerics in Iran. And it made a huge demonstration within Qom. It's kind of the political consensus against them within the very traditional institution of the religious institution in Qom. And it was a kind of the mistakes that made at the time. Backs to some such kind of the political naivety at the time for such a movement, that they made some mistakes that was socially sensitive for the society. It was very important, and they easily being framed as a anti-national, anti-religious movement. Such kind of the radical, aggressive strategy led to a fall of the Reformists for several years. And I think that there are some more details in my paper, while at the moment I would like to revise my paper, because paper has been finalized a few weeks ago and I need to add something to it. But a lot of technical details that has been mentioned there, and it's empirically important for the study of such period of the Iranian political history. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Recently, in an international symposium in Istanbul, it was discussed and told that Muslim countries, the actors living in Muslim countries, we are away from each other and get information from other languages, particularly in English, produced in the West. But we lack the communication between each other and try to understand the happenings within our societies and to understand the dynamics. So thank you so much, Dr. Imani. You introduced us both historically and also other political, sociological dynamics within the Iran society and the political spectrum. I can imagine there are many missing elements, features which are influential in Iran politics, as well as the political social movements. We will continue discussing that. You have made a kind of two ends, traditionalists and modernists. Perhaps there are more to discuss as factors of the change. We have the third speaker who would also contribute to this debate as well, Mohamad Mashin. He is also from Iran, a profession of law. Mohamad is running a volunteer group dealing with translations of books and publications. Mohamad is going to join us with his discussions and comments on the two presentations. You have 10 minutes, Mohamad.
Of course, thank you. Hello. Today, I think we heard a lot of accurate historical facts about the challenges in front of us for a democratic transition in a Muslim world. And I have no doubt the topic is most complicated and has a lot of aspects to it. However, as Dr. Bayram and Dr. Emamian touched upon, many of us usually assume that if not all, many of the challenges in front of us are of religious nature. And I don't think that is the case, really. I can provide a lot of examples, but according to the time, I can try to provide as many as possible. One of the cases we see very often is that very smart people in Muslim majority countries market their own ideas as the position of Islam. The thing is, if I'm, for example, I'm a relatively young person, if I have an idea, I think it's a good one, but defending an idea, putting it out there, it's not an easy task. It may not endure the, as Deirdre McCloskey put it, the challenge of the market. I'm not sure exactly the term, but something like that. Don't quote me on it. So my idea may not endure the challenge of the market. So I may attribute my idea to Islam. I say, this is the Islamic position. And a lot of Muslims are committed to Islam, and they would defend it with all they have, with even their life. So, which is a good thing, of course, but comes the time that they may defend an idea that really has nothing to do with Islam. And we have a lot of cases about this. And well, usually you can find some hadith remotely interpreted to support the claim and so on and so forth. So, and there is a lot of dangers to this. One of them being that when some ideas fail, an idea that you attributed to Islam, it is written down as a failure of Islam, a shortcoming of Islam, where it is not. And the other thing is that, as Dr. Bayram touched upon, eloquently outlined actually, is the matter of rhetoric. I'm sure many of you have heard this story when two people were debating if they can convince the religious leader to allow them to smoke while they're praying. And one of them thought it was impossible and went ahead and asked. And of course, the answer was negative. The other one went and said, just formulated the question differently, formulated as if, while I'm smoking, can I pray to God? And the answer, of course, was yes. So we see in this case, again, coming back to the main issue, a lot of people formulating their own agenda, marketing it in a very Islamic package. And we actually, let me give you an example. Back in late 70s, early 80s, a bunch of Iranian economists came back from the United States at the height of, Vietnam War, student movements, and, the height of popularity of socialism. So they came back to the country right after the revolution. They had a lot of ideas. They were ambitious, they were smart, and had very little experience. So I think even they would agree that their ideas couldn't endure a public debate. Never could endure a public debate. However, they went to Muslim leaders in Iran, and they formulated a question like this. The current system, the current banking system we have, it is basically the usury. We are committing usury. And do we want to continue this? Of course, the answer of the leaders were, well, no, we don't want to commit usury. That is not a preferable. So they said, we have a solution for this. We can come up with a banking solution, we can with a banking scheme that is not involved with usury. We can eliminate it. Of course, not all actually, some of the Muslim leaders in Iran at the time agreed with them and told them, go ahead, do it, and we'll see what comes out of it. About 40 years later, we are in such an agony, such a convoluted the system we have. Just a bunch of recently graduated. I don't want to say children, but basically that was what they were at the time. Drawn out some half-chewed idea, and now we're stuck with it. And reforming it is not easy at this point. It's actually very hard. So they presented it as the Islamic banking without usury. That is the title, actually. And so we're stuck with it. And now it doesn't work. It is kind of usury, actually.
1 minute.
And so people call this failure the failure of Islam. They think Islamic economics doesn't work. And the whole thing had nothing to do with this. Thank you. I have more examples, but I think I'm out of time.
Thank you, Mohamad. Your presentation also covers another 2-day of debates. There are many practical aspects which are presented as parts of the religion itself, of Islam itself. We need to work on it, and which are inherited, indispensable parts of the religion itself, or a historical, traditional interpretation, or a cultural interpretation instead of a part of an Islam. So thank you so much. I would like to leave the floor quickly to you, so as to receive as many questions and comments as possible. The floor is yours. There is the microphone. I would just ask you to be as precise, as short as possible. you can make comments, of course.
Yep.
Yes, please. And please, could you introduce yourself?
Okay, sure. Good afternoon. My name is Diofi Alfat from Frederick Naumann Foundation for Freedom.
Okay.
I have two questions to Dr. Emamian. The first one is regarding to the causes of the fall of Iranian reformists. You mentioned in your writing the root causes are, the first is political radicalism and the second one is intellectual radicalism. In your opinion, do you think that there is a correlation between this radicalism with the growing dominance of Iran rifles in Middle East?
Did you understand? I couldn't hear. Could you repeat the final sentence again?
In your opinion, is there any correlation between the growing radicalism with the growing dominance of Iran rivals in the Middle East? Okay. The second one is regarding to the cause of the decline of democratic value in Iran. Which one is more prevailing in terms of hindering the democratic transitions within Iranian people between the cultural values and religious values?
Okay, thank you so much.
Oh, yes.
Which one is? Did you ask which is more influential, the cultural values or the religious values?
Yeah, in
are more
hindering the
influential to
transition.
Make the reforms fail,
Clear.
right? Okay,
thank you.
Thank you. I will take the questions first. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Farid Alatas from National University of Singapore. I have two questions. The first one concerns this question of Islam and what the so-called the question of the compatibility between Islam and democracy. And I think we've heard many times here as well as elsewhere that Islam is not to blame. Islam is not, the fault is not Islam. And of course I think many of us agree with that. But it really depends on what we mean by Islam. If you mean the Quran, yes, the Quran is not to blame. If you mean the revelation is not to blame. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about Muslim ideologies, Muslim theories, like for example Islamic economics. Islamic economics is to blame. We're talking about what you were referring to. Much of Islamic political theory, especially modern political theory, some of the perspectives are to blame. So we need, I think, to go beyond defensive mode, to actually examine the problems in these various perspectives. Islamic economics, as far as I'm concerned, is actually bourgeois economics dressed up in Islamic terminology. It functions as an ideology for capitalism, but there has been little critique from within Islamic circles of Islamic economics. So perhaps you could maybe address some of those issues. My second question is this, and this is about Iran. When I look at various attempts to democratize, I look at Malaysia, Indonesia, Iran, and Turkey, and where I think there are serious attempts to in Malaysia for some decades, in Indonesia since 1997, the fall of Suharto, and of course more recently in Turkey and Iran since the revolution. But there's a big difference between Iran and the other three countries. In Turkey, Malaysia, and Indonesia, there is an independent capitalist class, an independent private sector, which I think plays an important role in support for democratic institutions. It seems to me that is lacking in Iran, that much business, much of the private sector is in the hands of revolutionary guards. Now, my question to you is this: how do you see the future of democracy in Iran, or the possibility of expanding democratic space in the absence of an independent or relatively autonomous capitalist class? Thanks.
Thank you. How shall we start, please? More questions?
Okay. Thank you for your questions. In terms of the correlation between radicalization of the Iranian politics and some gains in Middle East challenges at the moment, most recently a successful kind of the being successful against ISIS in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, and everywhere. I would like to differentiate between different meaning of the radicalization. The radicalization that I mentioned in my paper and my lecture was about the aggressive discourse of democracy that framed democratic revolution, democratic movement against traditional and established values and cultures and traditions. What we are calling about the radicalization and the correlation of this radicalization and the Iranian proxies gain in the Middle East is different meaning of the radicalization. What we are seeing there, it's a kind of the religious rhetoric that has been too intensivizing for Iranian proxies across the world. Look at the Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq, and Ansarullah in Yemen. Everyone that has been connected to the Iranian administration at the moment, they are all religious one. Perhaps they are not anti-democratic. Even Hezbollah in Lebanon is not anti-democratic. And it's a kind of the mix we need to think about at the moment. The Iranian religious interpretation, that is Shia interpretation of the Islam, has two clear elements of the democracy inside itself. I'm not a theoretical man. I'm not going to inside epistemological, theoretical, philosophical debate about that. But look at some elements. Anyone that is working with such kind of the ideas, there are some democratic, popular elements inside themselves. And this, I wanted to make a kind of a distinction between two meaning of the radicalization. Radicalization of democratic movement that created a kind of the political consensus within the establishment that this kind of the movement is too aggressive and too dangerous for our national security, something like that. And radicalization, the other kind that I wouldn't like to call them radicalization, is a kind of the more religious kind of the ideas that we need to be against, for example, oppression, particularly against ISIS, as a manifestation of the religious radicalization. And we need to distinguish between these two, the meaning of the radicalization. In terms of the, which one is more influential, religious ideas or democratic ideas? It's again a kind of the oversimplification.
Religious or cultural?
Religion is part of the culture.
Okay, this is
and
what he says.
No one can make a distinction between these two. But if you are bicultural, you are meaning the democratic ideas and religious ideas. It's a bit difficult to clearly weight which one is more influential at the moment, because there are a lot of mixed elements of the religious ideas and religious movement and the democratic movements. But one of the mistakes that I missed time to mention during my lecture, one of the mistakes by radical friction of the Reformists in Iran was underestimation of the religious influence in Iranian society. Once their opponents, their rivals, were successful to frame them, I would say it's not a part of it's not truly framed, but they were successful to frame them as an anti-religious movement. It was the end of their life, political life, because religion is deeply rooted in Iranian society. While we have a lot of elements of the anti-religious normal lifestyles, particularly in big cities, but look at what is happening in specific ceremonies. Just 2 weeks ago, we have a very specific ceremony in Iraq. more than 2 million Iranians gained visa and they went there just in very difficult situation in terms of the logistics, difficult logistic status and situation. But more than 2 million Iranians, they went there for doing a kind of the religious ceremony, a ziyarah. And deeply rooted as part of the Iranian culture. To be honest, it was not part of my discussion, but it's very important that we need to analyze Iranian culture based on 3 different elements: religious elements, national elements, and democratic or Western-oriented elements. And we have always mix of these 3 elements in Iranian culture, and we should analyze Iranian politics based on the different balance of these 3 elements in different political movement. In terms of the last question of Dr. Al-Attash, I would say it's a kind of the exaggeration about the role of someone like some institutions like Revolutionary Guard in in Iranian economy. We have a lot of statistics there, but it's a kind of the exaggeration of that. In last decade, more than 15 years ago, we had a kind of the privatization, huge privatization program in Iran that has never been fully applied, but at the moment we have an enormous, important part of the economy that has been privatized to some extent. I would say that there is also some other elements of pro-democratic movements that they are not only based on private enterprises or private economy. You are right that at the moment there is no huge part of important part of Iranian economy has been privatized yet, but it's a trend that has been started at last 15 years, and it's going to be more, particularly because of a new interpretation that came out from Iranian constitution. It was very important that based on the Iranian constitution, it was difficult, it was not allowed Iranian government to privatize some parts of their assets. But based on the new interpretation that came out from the top level in Iranian administration, it's now allowed, and it's possible to do that.
Okay. Mohamad, would you like to add anything?
Just
to the questions on Iran?
Yes, just a quick note.
Okay.
I think you answered it yourself. You correctly pointed out that the thing that we call Islamic economics is this or that branch of economics dressed as Islamic economics. Islam is a religion, and economics is economics. And there are different schools of thoughts in economics. So I think you're actually adding to what I mentioned before, that a lot of people are marketing their own ideas as being the position of Islam. I think we can go so far as to say that Islam, as in the seerah of the Prophet and the leaders, and so on and so on, the heritage we have inherited, is or isn't compatible with modern economics. And I think it is. I think we can go so far, that far. But to interpret, we have had these, triumphs, and they tried to, at the time, they thought socialism was science, was a scientific way of doing things, and Islam is the deen of Haqq, and it is the final word, so it must be compatible with the latest science. So they tried to merge them together and came up with, so in some parts of the world you see Islamic economics, some sort of capitalist, and in other parts, in Iran in particular, you see a socialist rhetoric dressed as Islamic economics, none of which I think. So what I'm saying is we shouldn't allow people to dress up their own ideas as the position of Islam. And about the capitalist class, Dr. Emamian, I think, covered it very good, and I too agree that the privatization, as Dr. Emamian mentioned, wasn't applied fully. I think there's a lot of room to be for improvements, and we don't have that class yet, and I too think it's coming. And I think it will have a very important role to play.
Okay. Would you like to add anything? Small.
Yeah. Actually, when I talk about, of course, Islam, not as a theologian, not as a theologian, I'm talking about the social, I mean the place of the religion in society. And when we talk about democracy, it is very well flourished in, let's say, firstly in Christendom. We do not use this labeling anymore, but in medieval age, everybody was talking about Christendom. And we clearly that, for example, when we think of history of democracy in Christendom, and in the earlier sessions you talk about, for example, feudalism. For example, feudalism itself is a very, very important factor in establishing a very well-grounded democracy, I think, because it is an experience of decentralization of political power. Yeah, it is to say that historically your culture has such rooms. I mean, this is not a matter you can, let's say, attribute to religion. I mean this way, therefore, I'm not very good at theology, actually. I try to be a good Muslim myself. That's just my personal, nothing else, just not my personal affairs. For example, in Christian theology, we clearly know that similar debates took place between the relation between democracy and Catholicism, and there are many resemblances between these two ones. And actually, I met such a question: is Catholicism compatible with democracy, for example? But all these are historical facts, and I always put that. Culturally, the societies are always in change, whether they have a transformation in accordance with the democratic precepts or not. That is not something let's say, to forecast or something. Thank you. Yes.
Again, Abdul Wahab Al-Kibsi, Center for International Private Enterprise, Washington, D.C. What Dr. Al-Attas was alluding to, if I understand him correctly, is separate from the privatization process. The privatization process is a constitutional mandate. Since Khomeini's time, at its best, it was a way to move ownership of means of production from the state into maybe even the bonyads, maybe even not just the Revolutionary Guards, but shares that distribute to everybody as the citizens. That's different from the presence of a private sector that is organized and can advocate for change, institutional change. These are two different things. And I don't want to mess up the two. I mean, until we understand that you cannot have real democracy without competition between different sectors of society that includes a strong, organized private sector, then you do not have a private sector. Privatization is not going to do it. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. A very impressive presentation.
Yourself?
My name is Fazil from Ikram Youth. I just want to ask Dr. Bayram about dynamism of the democracy in Turkey. I believe that the differences, or how the people articulate the differences, it must be resolved based on the compromise. And I believe that Turkey, they got a lot of experience on that. Can you share with us the Turkey experience between how to to solve the conflict between democracy and the politics itself? You said that it's rather than we see that this is a politics versus religion, it's better to see it politics versus state. So how the Turkey really experience on that thing.
Okay, shortly, because we will have a session on Turkey too, but you can,
And
if you like, you
the
can
second
just-
question,
Türkiye nasıl şey yapıyor? Din ve siyaset arasındaki gerilimi nasıl çözüyor? Birbirine
and the second question to Dr. Seyed, it's really conflicting between modernity and traditions. I just want to very simple questions. How the Iran's belief on the democracy that give the limited government? I mean, rather than you just give all the powers to the government, it give more people give powers to the families, to the foundations, to the NGOs. How do Iranians believe on the limited government? Thank you very much.
Can I add one question? I'm Rafiullah Azmi from Delhi. I just want to pose a question to Dr. Seyed. My question is that there was a reformist tendencies, as you state, that starting from 1997, since Khatami came, there was attempt being made to reforms and make its system more liberal. That went on, but in 2009 there was Green Movement and everything fizzled out after that. Whole movement was crushed out. My simple question is to you that would you believe that it was more because of meddling from outside? United States of America has not reconciled with the Islamic Revolution of Iran since 1979, and it has not accepted the regime which is there. So that was encouraging the movement behind the scenes. Everything was being done. So perhaps Iranian regime, which is there, they use this as a threat to national security, as you were talking about, and perhaps that kind of movement which was taking was as an effort to make Iran more liberal, more better. Perhaps that went out of it. Would you like to say something? What I'm trying to say, that within Iran there is a struggle going on between hardliners and soft and reformist kind of narratives is going on. So since 1979, and in 1997 it was gaining, Khatami came, and then after that. But what has happened in 2009, perhaps the date might be, I'm not sure about, I think it's Green Movement. Then everything was, muzzled out, repressed. Things crackdown were there. My argument is that it failed more because of the external intervention, because United States is always bad guys in the Iranian imaginations, as Iranians are bad guys in the imagination of the United States of America, because since 1979 both are not able to reconcile. America has not tried to reconcile with Islamic values of Iran because it's challenged the hegemony of the United States of America, and for a variety of reasons. And so regime, whoever be there, they always make any kind of things which is posing resistance to the establishment, a kind of security threat. See what Mubarak has been doing in Egypt. He has been always talking about to America, look, I am your bulwark against the Islamic radical forces. If I am removed, then you will face this kind of problems. Otherwise, you have to support me. This is your helplessness. So that is what regimes many times have been doing. I think attempt was also made in case of Turkey, but Turkey somehow succeeded. External intervention was and factors, but Erdogan was very charismatic and things like that.
You mean kind of security threats are becoming a kind of an excuse to question the country itself?
Yeah, of course. Focus. Yeah. Good questions. Thank you very much. Let's start from the last one. I would like to stay as much as possible neutral, not ideological, politically or even pro-democracy, pro-religion, something like that, as a social scientist, as someone that is researching on public policy. The reality is too complicated than such kind of a simplification, pro-democracy, pro-religion, pro-Western, anti-Western, something like that. It's just kind of the simplification, and it's very useful for the media, but not for deep analysis. What happened in 2009 in crackdown, it has been framed differently in Iran. Someone says that, for example, Green movement was a pro-democracy movement. Someone says no, they were anti-democracy because there was election, because there was anti-election, something like that. They never accepted the election. While election has a lot of problem, technical problem, but there was election. Again, the same election that Khatami gained, the same election that Rouhani gained, the same election. And there are different framing of the problem. And I'm not in favor of one against another one. But I'm saying that the reality is too complicated. Even, for example, Ahmadinejad was too popular. Still, he is too popular in Iran, in poor people, lay people. Ahmadinejad gained the power, and all statistics showed that he actually gained the power in 2009. No paper published, no rigorous paper published that there was a kind of the fake kind of the election. There was a lot of technical problem at the moment. But I never studied the election myself. Just I'm saying different framing, and no one could simplify what happened in 2009 between pro-democracy against democracy. But what you are saying that have they been framed as pro-Western as a pretext to crack down them? Yes, that's the case. As I said, one of the mistakes that some radical friction of the reformists done, not only in 2009, before in 1997, that they easily been framed as anti-national, pro-Western, wise, pro-US, such kind of the things. And in Iran, there is a good pretext, not only for security service, even publicly, it's not still acceptable, someone that is pro-US. Yes, in Obama term, it was different. But now, if you are going to frame someone as pro-Trump, or at the time pro-Bush, yes, it's publicly is publicly dead. Someone that is framed as pro-Bush or pro-Trump is publicly dead in Iran, and it's a pretext. It's a kind of the political battle that different parts of the political battle they are trying to use some tactics to dismiss the rival. It's a part of the reality, but reality is too complicated than such kind of the saying in media. In terms of the democracy and limiting the governance that you ask about it, to be honest, again, as someone that is studying public policy, we are thinking about the new modes of governance, and we are trying to promote that participation, public participation is in new modes of governance is very helpful, very important for the governance in total, as a whole. Look at the earthquake that happened 2 weeks ago. Yes. There was a huge wave of the participation from the NGOs, from civil society activists. They were very important for the government as well, because they undertake a part of the government responsibility. And it's a part of the reality on the ground that, yes, traditionally all governments across the world, they were thinking about participation as limitation of the government power. But if government was too intelligent and too efficient to manage to use such kind of the potentials in the way by some kind of the new institutions. We are at the moment in my university, we are studying regulatory framework as a governance institution to use economic potentials of private sector, but to apply government policies through the private and civil society actors. It depends on how traditional is government or how modern government is thinking about the process. In terms of what Dr. Abdul Wahab said, yes, I agree with you that we don't have such a private sector that as a driver of what's so-called democracy. Still, I am trying to be neutral, not pro-democracy, not pro-religious, but you are right, that's the case.
Yes, I just wanted to add, you're absolutely right, but keep in mind, after the revolution, government got over about 80% of the industry. Without getting out of it, there will be no capitalist class. It cannot, I don't think it cannot grow. So it's not sufficient, but it is necessary, in my opinion, for the government to get out of it to allow for the private sector to come in. And I'm saying it is coming because there are a lot of startups, a lot of ventures, and so on and so forth. So I'm very optimistic about it.
Okay, thank you for the question. I am not an expert in history of Turkish politics, but I have something to say, a few things to talk about this one. Of course, we must be careful in this. Firstly, the relation between religion and politics and the relation between religion and the state, they are a bit different things. And like any countries almost in the world, the religion and politics is interwoven in Turkey. And Turkish people are religious people mainly. Therefore, any kind of political leaders, they are at least they feel the need to tell something related to their religious practice or religious life. But in terms of the relation between religion and the state, in Turkey, that was a bit, or this is a bit problematic, I think. And of course, it is a very long history. For example, during Ottoman Empire, the Padishah, the Sultan, was also the claim of the head of the spiritual authority. Caesaropapism, a kind of Caesaropapism took place in Ottoman Empire. And this bureaucratic habit was definitely inherited by Republic, definitely. Constitutionally, in Turkey, according to Turkish constitution, the state, as a state, is in, let's say, laïque. We use the French word in Turkey, laïque. I mean, it may be secular, but in terms of the practices or in terms of the interpretation, the jurisprudential interpretation of these principles, sometimes this it may become, let's say, a very militant understanding of secularism as a state religion sometimes. But we have this formal separation, but in terms of, let's say, disturbing the possible, let's say, compromise of let's say, the state and the religion, I think it still have some risks. But now, because the ruling party is considered as pro-Islamic, therefore they said, oh, everything is wonderful. But this, I don't think so, because we personally, many of the people from the same age, we are almost the same age, we personally experience that sometimes it is strictly interpret this the principle of laïc is strictly interpreted by the power elites. We know this personally, and I think the problem emerges everywhere. Possibly, yeah. I mean, all the political systems are possibly open to such problems. This is something mainly related to the existence of inclinations, totalitarian inclinations of any state. Therefore, I mean, the liberal understanding of, you see, the separation between church and state. For the United States, there's a great wall, they say, between this one. Because Turkish society is mainly Sunni society, there's no clergy, or there is no a permanent institution of jami, or autonomous ones. Therefore, all the clericals in Turkey, for example, they are also state, let's say, civil servants, state backed officers. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your questions, for your contributions. Quickly, the earthquake example reminded me our desperate, sad experience back in '99, that terrible earthquake also revealed the fallacies of the bureaucracy, the state establishment in Turkey, how we failed to fulfill the needs after the earthquake, and civil society could come together to ask for reformation of the bureaucratic organization and to invest more in the infrastructure and ask for more of reforms within legal and political system. So those terrible sad experience would open a path for the civil society. So for this session, as well as the previous and also for the coming sessions, I just think that we have these two challenges also for the other conferences for the Istanbul Network as well. We have on the one side the need to discuss the interpretation of Islam within political terms, economic terms, social terms, or within the morality, our understanding. So we need to discuss the interpretation of the religion itself. And in the meantime, we need a discussion to have a plural system, a plural political system, which could guarantee a plural interpretations, different interpretations of the religion, as well as a plural civil society where the differences and different interpretations can coexist peacefully. Although there are international factors, as we discussed about Iran, or we could discuss about other countries, there are international or foreign factors could be perceived as threats to the system, to the regime, but for the civil society, for the civil actors, there are many issues waiting there. And we all have, these countries have different histories and cultural futures, so we need to find different unique paths to invest and expand more on the ideas of a free society related with Islam, religion, and liberty. And since we keep on discussing the political systems and the political governments, I value more to invest in ideas which actually in the long run they are more influential, and we need to try to produce a climate of ideas which would be influential for the public decision makers to follow. So, apart from the political systems, apart from reforming the decision makers, we need to invest in the market of ideas, and when the time comes, those invested ideas would be very valuable. That had been the case, I think, for Turkey. Thank you so much for your attention to this session. I wish to have time and opportunity to meet and talk with each of you. Thank you.